Hello everyone, my name is Rowena Walsh-Jarrett and I will be performing the welcome for you from Yaramna Place. I would like to start by acknowledging any elders present here today or joining us, our elders past and our ancestors. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present here or joining us today. I am a proud Dharawal Gumbaynggirr woman. I was born on Gadigal land with Gadigal, Bidjigal, Wangal and Gweagal, among other Sydney Basin clan bloodlines. My maternal grandmother is from the Timbri family of La Perouse, and I come from an unbroken line of Koris born here in Sydney. My people were fishermen and shell workers. We would move about following fishing seasons in this very harbour and surrounding rivers, from as far south as Wreck Bay and as far north as the mighty Hawkesbury River. My family still live and work on country out at La Perouse, in Redfern and surrounding areas. Traditionally, many nations gathered around the Sydney Basin area because of its great cultural significance and to ensure that cultural knowledge, practices and laws were passed on. Often moving around amongst our Sydney people and surrounding areas, we would follow customs such as being welcomed onto country by neighbouring nations and/or nations whose country we would pass through for reasons such as ceremonies, marriage and trade. This traditional custom was carried out to acknowledge our ancestors, people of the land past and present, acknowledge their customs and law, and to respectfully adhere to those customs and laws whilst on country. In turn, this ensured your safe passage through country. So it is with these experiences, the knowledge passed down to me, the bloodlines within me, and on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, I am honoured to welcome you to country. I welcome you to this country, country of the Gadigal, the land of the Gadigal since time begun. I would also like to extend an acknowledgement to you all for being a part of the continuation of our culture, customs and practices. Welcome. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowena Walsh-Jarrett, for a really beautiful welcome to country. Let me add my acknowledgement of the Gadigal and the Dharawal-speaking traditional owners of the land that we're broadcasting from today and the land that I'm lucky enough to be living on. I pay my deepest respect to the oldest living culture in the world, to the elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. I wish we're all in person at the Yaramna Place in Darlinghurst. This isn't just the home, the new home of the Paul Ramsay Foundation, but more importantly, it's a precinct for purpose. For now, we are still living in this world of Zoom, but the benefit of that is we have a number of people from all around the country joining us for this International Women's Day. So happy International Women's Day to all of you out there. Well, women make an amazing contribution to the world every day. This day is certainly worth celebrating. I have some incredible leaders joining me online, and we have people from across all different sectors who are with us on Zoom. I want to call out one very special warm welcome, a particular shout out to the students of Engadine High School. So great to have you with us. And extra special for me because through absolutely no planning of my own, it also happens to be the suburb that I'm lucky enough to live in. So thank you to you all for joining us, to my colleagues who've worked hard to organise this event, and a special welcome to the wonderful women and leaders who are on this panel with me today. And I'm going to get to introducing them shortly. We will have a discussion with the panel. At 9 a.m, we'll open to Q&A. So please feel free to start posting any questions that you might have for the panel or I into the chat at any time. And you can either ask the question by typing it directly into Zoom that everyone can see, or if you want to privately send a question, you can privately manage Nicola Hannigan and she'll put a note in the chat so you can find her easily and she'll make sure that we get the questions. Before we kick off with that panel discussion though, I want to do some storytelling, some scene setting, and maybe just be a little bit provocative. In recent years, I realised that I'd become an accidental philanthropist. Let me explain. Late one afternoon in June 2018, I gave a presentation about pressing social issues in Australia to a group of employees whose organisation was looking to introduce a sophisticated kind of corporate giving. Basically, they wanted to work out who should they give money to charity to. That same night, I got an email from the man who started not just the business in Australia, but the global business many years ago, a man called Alan Gray. And within 24 hours, he and I were Skyping. Him, his wife, and their adult children were establishing charities from around the world to give away much of the family's wealth. It was a chance moment in time. And after much due diligence, I'm sure on both sides, I ended up chairing the foundation in Australasia. And through this charity and their international arm, we've given away many millions of dollars over the last few years. I've had the privilege of meeting and speaking about the meaning of philanthropy with 4 generations of that family who are generous in spirit and generous in practice. The Gray family represent one of the public stories of philanthropy that I'd come to know as a young adult. A business person makes a lot of money and with their family ends up giving millions of dollars to charities around the world. While the Gray family are really humble and they give really behind the scenes and very privately, this kind of typical structured giving is what makes headlines. You would have seen this with the founders of Facebook, WhatsApp, Snapchat, Microsoft, and more recently, Canva. The list is really long, but it feels removed from most people's realities. And I still shake my own head and wonder how I even ended up knowing the Gray family and how lucky I am to now work for Australia's largest philanthropic foundation, the Paul Ramsay Foundation. This kind of wealth is almost impossible for people to conceive, including me, whose grandparents and their parents before them were all working class. When I was a kid, I didn't even know what philanthropy or a philanthropist was. I didn't know the words even existed. And yet, when I think of the root meaning of philanthropy, which actually means the love of humankind, philanthropy was within and all around me. I'd grown up in a household that taught me to carry change, so you've got it to give to people who are homeless and sleeping rough on the streets. I grew up in a family where even if bills were hard to pay sometimes, there was always money set aside for charity. By the time I was 13, my twin sister and I were giving our time volunteering for disability organisations. We were a family giving with and for the betterment of humanity. In thinking about these two seemingly conflicting worlds, philanthropy is structured giving for the wealthy and philanthropy as giving in whatever way you can with whatever you've got. And the topic for this International Women's Day, I began to ask myself, what is the climate or that general feeling about philanthropy in society? So, as all incredibly rigorous researchers do, I consulted Google and the Urban Dictionary. And the most liked definition for philanthropist in the Urban Dictionary was, and I'm quoting, a person who has nothing better to do with his or her money, so he or she figures that it would be more useful for his or her reputation to give away to society all the while making it seem as if he or she is unintentionally a good person, end quote. I won't give you the quotes from the other definitions in the Urban Dictionary, but let's just say that according to this particular source, philanthropy has a bit of a reputation problem. The historian in me wanted to better understand this public narrative, this public story, especially through a gendered lens. What were the stories of philanthropy and women through history? In 2008, Philanthropy Australia published a story called In Her Gift, and that briefly traced the history of women's philanthropy in Australia. In summary, their story wasn't too far from my starting point. Philanthropy was for the wealthy. There weren't so many wealthy women in Australia because of our penal colony background, and therefore women's philanthropy started with women establishing charities. As wealth grew in Australia, women gave via their family wealth, and as women became increasingly employed, increasingly independent, increasingly wealthy, women's philanthropy also grew. And there are some amazing legacies around philanthropy being embedded in charities. The Australian Red Cross was formed in this way by one of the early Governor General's wives, Lady Helen Munro Ferguson, and she and the governor's wives from across the country set up the Australian Red Cross with divisions scattered around the country. And it's an amazing legacy, but their story still reflects that idea that philanthropy was for the elite and the wives of the wealthy. For me, one of the most interesting aspects of history is who writes it, whose voices are amplified, and whose voices are silenced or missing. And when we switch the lens and we change up those keywords that we search for in examples of philanthropy, and we think more about philanthropy being about that original meaning of the love of humanity, other less well-known stories begin to appear. Women in Australia have been acting as philanthropists throughout history for the love of humankind through their generosity of spirit, rather than necessarily by being called philanthropists. Women's philanthropy in Australia is a history of the generosity of giving with whatever they had for a more equitable future. It's a story of giving through kinship, through kindness, through courage, and through creativity. And it's absolutely a story that did not start with colonisation. This love of humanity and country was deeply embedded in Aboriginal culture for over 60,000 years. The oldest living culture in the world embraced giving through kinship. And as Deadly's story explains, kinship helps determine a person's relationship to others, to the universe, and their responsibilities towards other people and countries. And this is a story that's scattered everywhere through our history, if only we start looking for it. Let me share just a couple of these women's stories in the areas of arts, Aboriginal justice and equality, and social reform for kids and transgender rights. Despite making very little money, there are a bunch of 19th century born women artists, including some you might have heard of: opera singer Dame Nellie Melba, novelist Miles Franklin, yes, she was a woman, and artists Portia Geesh and Alice Bale, who donated money and left their estates to music, literature, and art. In the area of Aboriginal justice and equality, there are many women I could pull from, but one of my favourite stories is a woman named Ella Simon. Ella is a survivor of the stolen generation, and she was Australia's first Aboriginal Justice of the Peace. She gave so much of her time, her voice, and her talent to improving the lives with and for Aboriginal people. She did things like obtained a community hall so young people could learn to read and write. She fiercely fought to stop children from being stolen. She lobbied for the right of Aboriginal people to leave the reserve, to handle money, to have a bank account. She supported the installation of electricity on the reserve. And before we even knew the word social enterprise, she had obtained funding from the Country Women's Association to set up Gillawarra gift shop, and her and other women sold Aboriginal artefacts. Profits from that gift shop paid for electric stoves for all of the houses in that particular reserve that she was on. She was an incredible advocate for better health, better financial security, food security, and ending discrimination. And even though if you Google philanthropist, she will not appear, her actions suggest otherwise. She dedicated most of her 80 years to the betterment of others in and around her community. In the area of social reform for children, Selena Murray Sutherland was an absolute pioneer in this country. She had grown up in poverty. She worked as a nurse to support kids that were sleeping rough living in Melbourne. She became the primary driver of helping to end child prostitution in brothels in this country. She was given the title Lady Missionary and became one of the first paid child welfare workers in Australia. And she donated whatever she had to the children she was supporting and raised money to keep homes going to support these kids. When she died, she had no possessions. She had £10, which is about $18 in her bank account. But she had made the world so much richer by rescuing over 3,000 kids from streets and slums and brothels across Melbourne. And hundreds turned up for her funeral and helped pay for her tombstone. Fast forwarding to more recent times, the 20th and 21st century have seen other remarkable women philanthropists come to the fore, using their voices for transgender rights. Estelle Asmodel was a fierce advocate for the right to amend the gender status on birth certificates, and as a result, in 1987 became the first legally recognised transsexual in Australia. Decades later, many of you would have known the story of Georgie Stone, who at 10 was the youngest to receive hormone blockers and became a fierce advocate for transgender young people in Australia. By 17, she'd led a high-profile petition that resulted in young transgender people in Australia no longer having to go through the family court to access hormone treatment. These are just a couple of stories of remarkable women who, coupled with their kinship, kindness, creativity, and courage, with the capital from wherever they could get it, have helped make this world and this country a more equitable place to live. And we've also seen this through the culture and actions of many migrant women who have come to Australia. We have seen women increase in social entrepreneurship, social enterprises, collective giving, women's donor networks. And through COVID, women have been remarkable in their leadership around rallying to give voice, resource, their talent, their time, their kindness for a betterment of society. Women continue to contribute more of their money to charity, more of their time to volunteering, and more of their time to doing unpaid care than men, respectively. But there's so much work left to do for a more equitable tomorrow. Despite Australia being one of the most wealthiest nations in the world, 1 in 6 kids live in poverty. 1 in 4 are digitally excluded. 1 in 200 are homeless on any given night. 1 in 100 of our young people. We have serious inequities still in education and employment, and we've failed to close the gap with many First Nations outcomes. In this country, we are still putting 10-year-olds in jails. 10-year-olds belong in the playground, not prisons. On the hopeful side, we are in a time of great generosity of spirit, of talent, of treasure, of huge possibilities. We're innovative, we have new forms and functions with social impact investment, inversions of power, and fabulous leaders, many of whom are on this Zoom. And we have a growing climate of philanthropy. But if we're really going to harness this climate of philanthropy for a better tomorrow, we need to think about how we perceive and tell stories about philanthropy. Philanthropy is the love of humankind, yet the stories we often get told as the public are around these really formal structures of giving. And foundations like the Paul Ramsay Foundation loom large, and rightly so. We've given away around $700 million in grants, and the capital given by Paul Ramsay Foundation and other philanthropic organisations across the country, ultra and high net worth individuals, through PAFs and trusts, corporate foundations and community foundations, are incredibly important. But there's something lost when philanthropy is only commodified. Maybe we don't need to change the climate of philanthropy, but rather our understanding of what philanthropy is. Maybe we need to change the stories we tell each other and ourselves. Stories of philanthropy by Australian women leaders through history demonstrate the power of capital coupled with kindness, creativity, courage, and kinship. I would like to suggest that if we're going to achieve a more equitable tomorrow, we need to reframe the public narrative away from philanthropy being just for the wealthy and the elite, and reclaim it as a generosity of giving with whatever it is we have to give. And the little girl in me who became an accidental philanthropist would be absolutely amazed at the possibility of what this might achieve for a more equitable future. When we look at the types of philanthropy, ways of giving, much has evolved and happened through history. And I'm joined today by 4 fantastic leaders who I'm going to have a discussion with. Let me introduce those leaders to you. Leah Armstrong is a Torres Strait Islander with over 25 years business and nonprofit experience. She's the Managing Director of First Australians Capital, an ambitious Indigenous-led impact first investment fund that aims to grow the pipeline of Indigenous businesses. Leah sits on a number of boards, current and in the past. Welcome, Leah. It'd be great to chat with you. Secondly, a very warm welcome to Shirley Chowdhary. Shirley is an international leader, lawyer, non-executive director, and passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion. She's worked in not-for-profits and corporates in Australia, the US, and across Asia. She was recently the Chief Executive Officer of the Go Foundation, and some of you may recognise her voice from the fabulous hosting she's done of the Women's Agenda podcast, The Leadership Lessons. Welcome, Shirley. Over to Hanna. Hanna Ebeling is the CEO of Sefa, and Sefa works to develop capital solutions and capability supports with for-purpose organisations. Hanna has moved from traditional banking to venture philanthropy and social impact investment. She has also worked globally, is a board director, and really contributes to improving collaboration across sectors. Finally, I have Rebecca Scott, OAM, joining us this morning. Beck has spent her whole career in innovation, firstly at the CSIRO and secondly as a social entrepreneur. You would probably know her best as the co-founder and CEO of the well-known Melbourne social enterprise STREAT, which has provided over 500 young people 16 to 24 years of age a healthy self, job and home. STREAT have supported another 1,500 young people through outreach programs and short courses and are starting to move into employment pathways in green jobs. And before I have a conversation with these four fabulous women leaders, I want us to hear from one of the amazing people who STREAT have worked alongside and give voice to Laura, since that's what we're all actually here for. So over to Laura.
Growing up for me was really difficult. So when I was about 9, my mum started to see my stepdad and I hated him. I'd be pushed into brick walls, I would be hit, I'd be punched, I'd be, you name it, that it happened. I was shoved out in a tent in the backyard with a baby blanket and a yoga mat in the middle of winter for 2 weeks. I think I dealt with being homeless a little bit better after experiencing that. My mum stood by him. If she was on her own with me, without him, she would tell me how it was wrong and she was sorry. But when he was around, she would side him as if she was scared of him. I'd had a disagreement with my mum. I told her that I was just going to my boyfriend's to get some headspace and then I'd be home later to discuss it, which is what we'd normally do. I'd normally go for a walk, I'd come back, we'd discuss it, it was all fine. And this one day I went home. She came to the door and said that I made the decision to go with my boyfriends. I must be happier there than I am at home. I guess I'll see you around. Remember that I love you, and slammed the wooden door in my face. I didn't truly believe it, that it happened. I rang the doorbell a few times and said, can we just discuss it? Until my stepdad came to the door and told me that if I didn't get off the property, he'd call the cops for trespassing. That's when he hit hard. I just felt I couldn't talk. I could barely breathe. All my stuff is inside. I have the clothes that I'm wearing and that is it. When I first went to STREAT, I was scared. I was scared. I was I don't know anyone. This is awkward. But yeah, we all sort of got on pretty quick. It was just okay, we're all in this together. So life skills was really good. Some conversations were hard. I'd walk out on a few of them. We did a lot on identity and who we were and where we thought we were going. Stuff on goal setting. And we'd do TAFE. So we've been doing our Cert 2 in hospitality. And I'm pretty sure I passed that. Feeling pretty confident. Days that weren't great. I could go into the office, the head office, and know that Kirsten and Liam were there for me. And the placement staff were always there for me. They'd always listen. If I'd come in and I wasn't great, they'd be all right, sit down. All right, tell me what's going on. They were always there for me. You don't get that anywhere else. It's been my dream my whole life to study at William Inglis. I got a letter, about 2 weeks ago, saying that I officially got accepted. So I'm pretty pumped about that. I look at my chef whites and all my uniform every day thinking it's one day closer. It's another day closer to saying goodbye to all my street friends, but it's another day closer to that. My previous life is hard. It still haunts me to this very day. Like slamming doors and stuff I still get traumatised by, but I'm not on the streets anymore. I've got a future. It's what makes me happy and gets me going each day now, really.
What a wonderful story. Beck, Laura is one of your 500 graduates, and her story, told through her own words, is a beautiful way of capturing STREAT, embracing that love of humanity that I was talking about. I want to go first to you and ask you on that notion of reclaiming this story of women's philanthropy being about the love of humanity through giving whatever you've got. How have you seen that played out in your work or your world?
I think certainly I've seen many women wrap their arms around us in so many different ways. If I think about, all of the corporate cafes that we run across inner Melbourne, the majority of those have come about by women internally in organisations saying, hey, we would really like to embed you here. So what I would call kind of social entrepreneurship often in organisations. But, obviously when you're running a social enterprise, another way people wrap their arms around you is by buying from you. So procurement of whatever it is that you're selling. One of the things that really strikes me though, and the young woman, Laura, who you just saw, again and again, what we see is the young people that that come to us in crisis. Again and again, one of the things that they want to know is how can they help and how can they give back? And so over the years, we've had so many of our young graduates, whilst they came to us originally and worked in hospitality became a stepping stone for them to then go onto other careers, into childcare, into youth work, into all different kind of professions. But again and again, we see, even for young people who have been in crisis and have really had a lot of barriers in the way, their strong desire to give back to the next generation of young people that are in that same situation. So I think, I think we are hardwired as humans to be social creatures, to be generous. I'd like to think, obviously when we look at the TV at the moment and we see this awful stuff happening, in Ukraine, we also know that we're highly destructive humans. But the better angels of us, I think, see again and again that kind of social capital being built in community. We've seen that through COVID, and I think women are so good at building social capital. Again and again, we see that we make the circle bigger, we make the circle more diverse, and I think that's part of the superpower of women.
It's a really amazing superpower, and I love that, making the circle bigger, and that sense of, like women as angels. Leah, I guess, and I referred to this earlier about the importance of kinship, and so I would love to pick this up with you because this isn't new, is it?
No. Thank you very much for inviting me, Kristy. And look, let me start by acknowledging country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal country as well in Sydney. And I'd like to pay my respects to all elders, past and present, but a big shout out on International Women's Day to the strong, brave and fierce Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women out there. Because, a few years ago, the catchphrase, because of her, I can, I think is so true. And because of you all, we can as well. So, yeah, look, absolutely. I think you picked up some really key and important aspects in your opening speech, Kristy. And for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, relationships, reciprocity, responsibility to family and community are always fundamental to the health and well-being of our families and our communities. And picking up the point that philanthropy or wealth goes way beyond, the monetary value, the dollars, in our communities. It's about our values, our principles, that relationality between, relationship with country, with spirit, with kinship. It's about intergenerational change and caring, the responsibility we have for the future, for our children. And also the love and collective care of our elders. These are sort of wealth, as Beck calls, social capital that has existed in our communities for 60,000 years. And I love this new term that Kerry Arabina has phrased, the modern matriarchy, which is, about, today's matriarchs and how we continue to contribute to the health and well-being of our people and our communities. And there are many, many, prominent Indigenous women that, are playing these modern matriarchs in our communities that stand out to me. And, I think this is something that is the invisible force in our communities, and how do we actually bring that invisible force forward, I think is critical for our future younger women.
How do we bring that invisible force forward? Going to throw you the really easy question, Shirley. And why don't we normally see this force?
Look, I think it's a number of things from my perspective. I think as women, we're really bad at telling our own stories. We've been brought up, the school system is really good at teaching us to be humble and not to be boastful. That is, I'm be really provocative, that tends to be a male quality, not a female quality. And men, conversely, aren't really great at telling our stories either. So our stories tend to fall through the gaps. And I think, what Leah was just talking about, Indigenous women being the carers for community and often taking on those really supportive roles, history's shown us that they've paid a price for that. So, if you look at female First Nations young people, historically, they've received offers to, for example, university at the same rate as the boys, but they tend not to take them up at the same rate. So actually, not only are we not telling our own stories, we're not propagating the view that we are out there doing good for humanity, but we're also disadvantaged by doing it and not sharing those stories. And so I think we're whacked from a number of different angles.
The being whacked, I want to come back to this invisibility piece in a bit and pick that up, because I think it's a really interesting discussion that we should be having. Hanna, from the that stories through history, and I know that you and Sefa do a lot of work in the innovation space, and I'm interested in your perspective around hidden stories of innovation that you have seen supported through Sefa, or just become exposed to through your work nationally and internationally. Have you seen innovations that are hidden, or are we more likely to see innovation show up because people, will put forward the shiny, new, great thing?
No, really good question, Kristy. I think obviously in terms of innovation, it really comes together with social change and wanting, to disrupt. And I think women are really well placed actually to do so because of the element of the nurturing and the caring, which just speaks to the kindness and the humanity, but then also having that determination and drive to actually want to achieve better outcomes for communities. And I think there's this really beautiful story actually that brings together the structured giving with the everyday giving of community and everybody. And so we at Sefa, when I first started there, one of the first clients I worked with is an organization called Tender Funerals. They're actually working with probably the provocative theme of end of life, etc. And they wanted to change the way we are doing funerals, more affordable and more culturally appropriate. So they have really, created very community-led model. And it's only now upon reflection that we realize all these different community sites of Tender Funerals are actually led by women. It's again a little bit of that invisibility, not being aware of it, and probably to your point, Shirley, not being sort of boastful and in a way proud and shout from the rooftops. And so we've really been working with them on a very sort of blended and very collaborative model that uses the power of structured philanthropy to contribute to the setup of a new funeral home, but then really also invites the community through a crowdfunding campaign. So everybody can contribute and stand behind the venture that happens to be largely led by really strong female entrepreneurs in community. So I think there's certainly a common theme around that those women who want to see social change really drive those elements.
I love that the piece around the example Tender Funerals is just amazing and worth looking up for anyone that hasn't heard of them before. I like this concept of the blended models, but I also want to pick up a piece. I want to pick up a piece around how we actually think about women as disruptors, because I think there's some really beautiful examples of women doing amazing leaderships for social good through care, reciprocity, kinship, all of those beautiful things that Leah brought up, but also this notion of women as disruptors and playing in the spaces that are sometimes traditionally male dominated and doing incredible good through that space. And Beck, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on some of the other examples from that perspective.
Oh, having come from my first decade in the employment at the CSIRO in science, I have to say that it was the walls were dripping with testosterone. I think in the top 22 research divisions at CSIRO when I was there, and only 2 were being run by women. So it was a very, very male environment. Wonderful, wonderful men. But I still remember finally getting to be fairly senior and going to my first executive meeting, and being asked if I would go out and get all the men all of their cups of tea, even though I was there, in my own right. And I think some of the ways that, women have to disrupt, often it's not that kind of loud and proud and, activism, although those things are critical. Often we disrupt in quiet resistance sort of ways. And I think often our disruption is actually going to what Hanna said really around kind of innovation. There's 2 types of social capital. There's bonding social capital and bridging social capital. And bonding social capital is what we do when we're with people like us. So it's kind of our in-group. But bridging social capital is that social capital when you reach out to others who are different from you, your out-group, diversity. And what we know kind of increasingly, I guess, to get stuff done in the world, the criticality of having both bonding and bridging social capital being there. There's really interesting research I was reading recently by Michigan State University saying about how that bridging social capital is really critical for innovation, because that's how you get knowledge exchange. When you're just in your same little group, you end up with a little echo chamber. But what happens when you reach out and you do that bridging and you do that, bringing in that diversity, that's knowledge exchange. And we know in any innovation system, the most precious commodity is knowledge. So I think women are really essential in innovation systems, and we do innovation a really different way, but it's that bridging capital, I think, that we've really got in spades.
The bonding and bridging capital, and hopefully everyone got the meaning of those 2. I won't repeat it. Beck did a really great job. I wonder, Beck, the thing about bridging is you have to know the people that you need to know to be able to bridge, or you have to be able to reach out. So either for Beck or any of you, if there are women listening to this, or just, the people and communities that we're aiming to support, how might somebody start to reach out if those networks aren't naturally there? We know when people come from more upper class or wealthy backgrounds, they tend to have a whole lot of those networks in place, and it's very easy to just connect without even knowing that you have those networks to connect to. So how do we make sure everyone has access to that notion of how we bridge?
Kristy, I'll start with a personal example for me. Arriving in Melbourne, having known no one at all, a new city, trying to build a new social enterprise, having no networks. And I certainly don't come from a family of any wealth. I come from a very working class family. My parents, the generation before, were both in poverty. So arriving in a city without resources, without an organisation, without staff, but that having kind of the bravery, I guess, to look around you and see amazing women who are around you, and then connect with those women. And I would say that for all of those, for all of the students who are on here today as well, find those women who inspire you, and then ask them for a coffee, or ask them, because I've never ever found a woman who's not generously giving of her time to help the next generation of young women coming through. So have the courage to kind of reach out to those women. And what I found here in Melbourne was this incredible group hug. These women who opened up their networks, who kept on connecting me to other women. Melbourne feels like home now after 15 years, or after 12 years. But that's only because of the generosity of people keeping on making the circle bigger.
Yeah, beautiful. I love the group hug. And I'm going to take this in slightly a more of a pushing way, but let's hold on to the concept of group hug because it's quite beautiful. I want to push this to the power side of things because, you know, some of these issues do play out around who has the power and who doesn't. And we see this even with, you know, going back to some of your earlier points around women sometimes being more invisible, and that sense of us having to do some things quietly or behind the scenes. And so my question is, you know, how, and I might flick to you, Leah, how have you seen power play out, and what more could or should be done to actually ensure that we're rebalancing power shifts for the kind of equality we want into the future?
Yes, look, I mean, I think this is a really important discussion, and just picking up, you know, again on the networking and also Shirley's earlier point about young Aboriginal women getting through university, but then the responsibility to family and community stops them from engaging and further in sort of building those networks. So, I mean, that is an important piece to note. And what happens is then you don't have those networks and you don't have that support mechanisms around you to actually open you up into the possibilities. And so what we're, you know, from my perspective in thinking about how do we you know, as people are now saying we need more diversity on our boards, we need equity on our boards, before they actually think about, you know, let's just get an Aboriginal or Indigenous person on their board, do they actually understand what it really takes to make them feel valued, to make them feel that they're effective, and that there needs to be a deeper commitment to ensuring that the board and the organisation has acknowledged that there is that power and dynamic that exists between, you know, those that have, you know, say for networks, who have the networks to get them engaged at the table, and also, you know, the power dynamics is also about acknowledging whose knowledge is being privileged in the conversation or at the board. How are their voices being recognised? How are decisions being made transparency in their consideration? And also, you know, that important thing about, you know, whose timeframes and who's being considered and mattered, because as we do have these responsibilities, you know, recognising that is an important piece about, you know, the time frame, the time commitments. So there's a lot of, you know, aspects, I think, around the power dynamics, and that is really important for you know, whether it's boards or whether it's in example of the work that we're doing in impact investing, about who's deciding what success looks like for and what impact matters for Indigenous businesses and in particular Indigenous women in business. Because when we talk to our Indigenous women who are in business and ask them about their why, about why they're in business, it's not about, you know, becoming financially rich and about growth for growth's sake and employment. When we talk to them, what lights them up is when they talk about, you know, how they're showcasing our culture or being role models to younger women, or having the means and being self-determining to actually have the time to give back to communities. So that's, you know, these are the things that matter in terms of when we're thinking about impact. However, the power dynamic plays out when we have funders or investors who have their theory of change, of impact. You know, that is about financial growth, and it's about targets and employment. So, I mean, it's so whose knowledge and voices are being prioritised in that discussion about that. And I'll just give you one example about, you know, the types of women that we're supporting. And there's a company which is set up by a mother and daughter, Kaylee Nicholson and Joanna Nicholson, called Ebeling. And for them, it's about caring for country and understanding whose country you're on, and educating and passing on that knowledge to non-Indigenous peoples. You know, it's about that, about developing a deeper respect for Aboriginal people and our values and our cultures. So, you know, that's the things that's really important for them, and that, you know, they recognise that previous generations haven't had that opportunity. So how can they instill that greater power and self-determination for the next generation? Another example is Alana Kennedy of Okasan, who we're supporting, who's a proud Wanji woman from the northern Queensland area, who really deeply understands about Australian sun and the harsh effects of sun, and through her experience and skincare knowledge and her lived experience as an Indigenous woman and her passion for supporting Indigenous women, that's what really lights her up when she's talking about her business. So again, sort of acknowledging, whose impact matters and how do we support that is really critical to understanding the power dynamics.
Kristy, can I jump in?
Please do, Shirley.
I agree with Leah on so many points, but I think she made a few really interesting ones. I think the first thing is just on diversity and inclusion. Diversity is fine. You can invite who you want around the table, but it is a waste of time if you're not giving them a voice and you're not listening to all those things that Leah just mentioned. So that's just the first point. And then the second point is power is not about, we need to be careful about the language we use. So Leah alluded to, the power dynamics at play when we're in that philanthropic space. It's not about doing to people. It's not about helping them. It's not about victim shaming. That deficit language and the deficit discourse that pervades so many areas of philanthropy, that is a power dynamic that we need to shift. And I think in recent years, I don't know if people have heard about this shift from old power to new power, but, the move from simple things like Facebook and Google and Instagram and all of those platforms have moved us from the traditional old systems of power generally held by old grey-haired white men to new power where it's crowdfunding and it's First Nations voices and where we listen to people who are struggling through disadvantage, and we actually walk with them hand in hand and listen to their voices leading the work we do, not us imposing on them what we think is the right way to do things.
Thanks, Shirley. And I think this conversation about how, often we read about, see people talking or doing things around diversity and inclusion, and actually what Leah, both you and Shirley have just done is sort of help us unpack that actually it's just not enough to talk about it, and there are things that we have to practically do to think through around what does that look and feel like to be meaningful. Shirley, I want to pick up the bit that you just landed on language, though, because I think the language we use is really important, and it's really hard. I mean, I know I fall into traps too, and every now and again you go, oh my God, I've said the wrong thing. The piece around language I want to pick up is this notion of what's called asset framing. And, I have spent my entire career in the for-purpose, mostly not-for-profit space. And, and the Paul Ramsay Foundation aims to shift cycles of disadvantage or help to. And, one of the key things we want to do is partner with others across sectors to be able to do that, recognising lots of different people, like the examples, need to come together to enable us to be able to do this. And the flip side of breaking cycles of disadvantage is for a better life, so people can, to work with people and alongside people so they can thrive. And I guess what plays out in that language is sort of two pieces to the puzzle. One is sort of the negative side of acknowledging that we have deep inequities in this country. We do have these things around cycles of disadvantage. We do have problems that we're trying to address socially, environmentally, etc. But how do we not get so sucked down into the negativity of it that we also can see the value that people have to offer, that we do have things that are about asset framing. And there's a guy that I really like called Trabian Shorters, and he came up with this phrasing, asset-based, but you might also know it around strengths-based. There's all sorts of ways to talk about this. And the challenge is, and Trabian explains it much better than I am, is that our brains are sort of wired. So we get used to these stories and patterns that we tell ourselves through the language we hear. And so if it's all negative, we think negative. And, if you think about, for those of you who have licenses, driving along in the car, how your brain is automatically trained when somebody pulls in front of you without an indicator to go, what an idiot, why didn't they put their indicator on? And how do we retrain our brains to go, what else might be going on here? Maybe the indicator's broken. But our brains tend to be focused in that. So how do we balance this issue of, acknowledging that we have these challenges in the world that really do need attention and being addressed, and making sure we hold this sort of language around valuing people and whatever it is that they aspire to. Shirley?
I think, to me, it comes down to one word. It's empowerment. We need to stop thinking about helping, and we need to start thinking about how we empower people to help them take control of their circumstances, give them access to opportunities, give them the tools they need to lift out of that entrenched poverty, and all the ways they experience it. I think there are so many parts of what you just said that I want to pick up on. I'm trying to unscramble it. I think in this country, I think our First Nations people feel the inequity of that lack of asset framing most acutely. You pick up a newspaper, well, we don't pick up newspapers anymore, but you open an online newspaper on any day of the week, and the stories about our First Nations people are negative. Who's in jail, who's done this, who's shot somebody. We don't celebrate the cultural positive stories, the successes enough. And so I think we need to reframe how we talk about these stories, so we're highlighting the positive more often and sharing those stories. I think we need to talk about empowering, so that we are always working from a strengths-based perspective. And thirdly, I think we need to, when we look at philanthropy to me falls into two distinct buckets. The first is the support that is needed for the consequences of disadvantage. So examples are going in and providing food for people who are sleeping rough, providing financial literacy to First Nations communities, all of those things that we have to do to lift. The second part, though, where I think we get lost and we tend not to spend enough time, but the evidence shows that philanthropists really want to spend more time, is on the systems change piece. Because it's not enough to continue feeding people who are sleeping rough. Actually, what we need to do is step back from it and look at how we can empower them to live a different life and to actually lift out of that entrenched inequality. And we don't spend enough time there. And I think I'm kind of going off topic, but you and I have talked a lot about the ecosystem idea. And I think if we can build ecosystems in different sectors of the not-for-profit world, and we can pull together philanthropists, government, community, individuals, organizations like STREAT, and capital to surround organizations in those sectors doing the same work, then I think we have a much greater chance at shifting the dial on some of these topics and actually moving from having 170,000 people sleeping rough in this country to having zero. But as long as we're not thinking about that, we're just going to grow that disadvantaged population.
Kristy, can I add something there too? Shirley, I totally agree. We did some research after a number of years of operating STREAT, and we went back out to all of those young graduates who had been with us and asked them, reflecting back now over years, what was it that was most precious or, had been most beneficial to them? And I remember thinking that, the obvious thing was that we were, we saw ourselves at the time as being a youth homelessness organisation. And so we thought that stopping their homelessness and giving them training and employment pathways would be the thing that was most valued. But again and again and again, what we heard from from that research was belonging and social inclusion was the thing that they had put the highest. When we dug under that, one of the themes that came out really strongly for those young people was that we see ourselves reflected in your team. When we walk in the door, I see myself. I see that around me, this looks like the United Nations. I think we have 22 different, staff from 22 countries. We've got staff from every color of the, on the queer rainbow. It's a rainbow, organization. You see yourself, whether or not it's ethnicity, whether or not it's gender and sexuality, you see yourself in the organization. And that came up again and again in the research. For those young people walking in, often we find that young people have been made homeless, either because they've, for example, when they come out. So when they come out of the closet to their family, that's often the thing that might result in a young person's homelessness. But Again and again, we've had young people say, this is the first place I felt safe to be me. It was the first time I could see myself reflected. And what we get, of course, is, lots of young people, as soon as they're feeling safe, they tell us who they really are and what they really need. So I think part of the solution is building our organisations to reflect our communities, because we can't do good work, trying to do transformational change if our organisations that are the vehicles that we're trying to do that through don't reflect our communities.
I love that. I love your I see myself. It's a beautiful articulation of making sure organisations do reflect communities. Leah,
yes. Sorry, Kristy. Can I just go back to your earlier questions about the language, and just a simple point that I'd like to sort of just raise in what we're trying to do at First Australians Capital as well is come from that strength space and just changing the simple thoughts of language around, as Shirley mentioned, as not doing to, not doing for, and even to the point that, even doing with. How about we reflect and say, how can we support innovation, and that comes from communities, therefore they are doing the business themselves. So, that is by Indigenous communities, that, the outcomes and the innovation and the empowerment is by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, that's the way we're sort of reviewing of changing that language of doing to, doing for, and actually focusing on supporting outcomes that are done by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
That's I love that, Leah, and I'm going to adopt it. Because it is a really doing, supporting so people can do it by themselves is back to Shirley's point about the empowerment piece all up. I mean, Leah, while I've got you, and Hanna, I'll come back to you. You may have some other things on this, but Leah, while I've got you, I want to pick up this notion of, because, the First Capitals, the work that you guys do is really amazing and so important in that ecosystem that Shirley talked about. And, we have to be able to get the funding so those Indigenous businesses, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can do the great work that they are doing. The interesting thing that often has been talked about historically is this shift, this difference between we do our investing over one side and we make our money over here, and we then do our philanthropy and our giving over there. And I think what you're playing at is starting to challenge that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see those, what have been fairly polar opposites historically.
Yeah, look, this is certainly a very big structural issue in the way, both, the investment or the side and the giving side is being, structurally developed here in Australia. I mean, what you see is on the money side, investment committees are stuck in mandates that are, about generating the most market rate of returns. And that does not necessarily reflect or match the intention of the impact aligned side or the giving and charitable side. So, and what we're seeing also is that as the ESGs become much more of a focus in decision making or where investments are going, there's certainly a great push towards the E and the green and the environment side. But what about the S, and how much more focus should be put on the S in social investment? So, it is a wicked problem and a structural issue. And recently the UK Commission of Social Investment report identified, when they looked at how social investment has been in the market in the UK for many years, that the root cause of these problems is particularly the lack of patient concessional capital for lending into social enterprise, and the lack of flexibility in the structure to design and develop the appropriate investment that is about what's the needs of the business. So going back to that power dynamic issue is about, focusing on what is needed for the business, not necessarily what the investor product is or what the investor has. So, those are the kind of the structural weakness that we're trying to address. So when we focus on our investment, it is really about bespoke about, what is it that puts the business at the centre and the needs that they are going to help them become sustainable. for, where do I see the potential change or coming from? We strongly believe that this is where the power of philanthropy can really lead on trying to address this issue. We believe philanthropy, has the power to be innovative and demonstrate how to close that impact gap on the investments and the giving side. That's where, First Australians Capital is hoping that, for an Indigenous-led and an Indigenous first focus fund, that we will, we see that we hopefully will be able to kind of, get a number of impact investors in philanthropy that will actually, look to how we're going to do that. If we look to the US and in terms of how big philanthropy over there is trying to address racial equity, there are examples there about organisations committing long-term to, addressing racial equity, investing in, supporting the infrastructure of organisations with untied funding, and also in, making sure that they're actually Black-led organisations. So again, going back to that, power by, Black organisation, or in our case in Australia, Indigenous first organisations.
I couldn't agree with you more, Leah, around this conflict between impact investing and philanthropy, because in a way, impact investing is supposed to bring the two parts together, the social impact and the financial returns. But a lot of times we see from a Sefa perspective the expectation of having the best of both worlds. So having market-based return and then sort of social returns almost as the icing on the cake. And so for us, we really see it's ultimately mindset shift and really come to our values, I guess, as a society, how we attribute value to both social outcomes and financial returns. And it's interesting that I think in a lot of times when we actually invest into social ventures, because they're so community driven and there are so many assets that you can't actually see on the traditional balance sheet in terms all of that strength-based, the organizational resilience that we've seen through crisis, bushfires, COVID, a lot of those elements of the humanity, but also then that entrepreneurial drive, I think really attributing value to that and recognizing it for what it is. I think that's still the journey that a lot of the social impact investors, and a lot of them are obviously also philanthropic investors, have to sort of marry up with, a lot of times it's we have to, meet minimum return targets, etc., which is obviously then in conflict. But ultimately, if you want to see certain change, systems change, then we have to, be on the right way to actually make the best of both worlds, but in a way that actually combines them in a very, very meaningful way.
Thanks, Hanna. Beck, I know STREAT are looking at going into the green space in a way that's sort of easy for people to understand. How do you think we need to tackle this piece around bringing together the points that Hanna and Leah have raised?
Probably what Hanna was just saying then, I think, is spot on. I think whether or not, and also Leah talking about ESG, environment, social, and governance, what people are looking for, all of this is around blending value, that we're understanding that, the only way we don't build things and we don't build communities just with financial capital. We've got social capital and cultural capital and environmental capital. And I think, for those of us who are we build things, we don't just rely on money to build things. We build things with all of those types of capital. So the value creation process, you're always blending these, in different proportions, these different things. And it's a really, we're being really one-dimensional if all we're thinking about is, what's on a balance sheet, because like Hanna said, a balance sheet is never the real reflection of the wealth and the wealth of an organization. And so I just think what we've got to do is we've really got to start to understand, one of the core, strengths of people is that ability to start to blend things. And I think the same when we're talking about environmental work. As an organisation, we've just started to move into training and employment pathways in green industries. But that was us as an organisation saying, you can't do human health unless you're doing planetary health at the same time. Once again, we have to be working at we have to be blending the impact for the both of those. And I think, those acupuncture needles in systems, I think, are where we're trying to blend value, and we're understanding that these things aren't, these things aren't dichotomous. They're actually, they're overlap. So I'm really interested in, where do we find those points in our system? We know in a system, if we're trying to address wicked problems, we've got to create lots and lots of smaller things that are, smaller size, an ecosystem of solutions. So rather than taking some big, taking one thing and scaling it, taking lots and lots and lots of little solutions and connecting those solutions up and building an ecosystem. So once again, going back to kind of where I started in that bridging capital, the connecting the smaller players and the actors on the ground is how you start to do radical innovation, to shift systems. And so I'm really excited about what does it look like to keep reaching out in that blending process.
Great, thanks, Beck. I'm about to go to Q&A from the audience. So please do, if you haven't already, get in your questions into the chat or send them directly through to Nicola Hannigan, and she'll feed them through to me and I can ask our fabulous panel. I think a lot of this discussion has been about leadership. Like if you look underneath the depth of all these things, you've been talking about the networks that people have access to or how you get them. We've been talking about the language that people use, actions, behaviours, rebalancing power and empowerment, even going back to Leah, your first point about, going from I can to we can. A lot of this is about leadership. So if you had to think through what kind of leadership would it take for a more sustainable tomorrow, and you just picked up one thing, and we'll then get into more detail in the depths of the questions, what's one type of leadership shift you would each like to see? Beck, I think you're still off mute, so I might go to you first.
That leadership that is very humble, that kind of servant leadership sort of style. So I see many people who wouldn't call themselves leaders, but are absolutely showing an incredible form of leadership. So it's it's that kind of, I'll keep going back to that reaching sideways. It's the sideways leadership, not the hierarchical up and down leadership. It's the flat structures that matter in leadership, I think.
Yeah, nice. Thanks. Hanna?
I think for me, it's this notion of togetherness, that together we can achieve more, that we need others to bounce off ideas, to get support, but also to be challenged. And that ultimately it's sort of the little ripples that, together achieve the big change for a wider systems change.
Nice. Leah?
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, it's always been about, picking up Beck's point about personal humility, but having that professional will to really get things done. And I'd like to sort of share this quote by Donella Meadows, which people may know or have heard of, but it goes, "The futures can't be predicted, but it can be envisioned and brought lovingly into being. Living successfully in a world of systems requires more of us than our ability to calculate. It requires our full humanity, our rationality, our abilities to sort through our truth from falsehood, our intuition, our compassion, our vision, and our morality."
Beautiful quote. Really beautiful quote. Thanks. And Shirley, over to you.
Look, I agree with everything everybody has said, that need for compassion and love. But I think also, especially in the not-for-profit space, leaders are so strapped for time and resources. So I would wish all leaders the time to kind of rise above their day-to-day and actually be able to see the longer-term picture and the broader picture, and to be able to do that longer-term thinking, because I think that's really vital.
Those are really wonderful things about our hope for leadership in the future. And the interesting thing about that is that I think all of the points that you've made around the leadership that we need, a lot of your points, although slightly different, connect back to leadership is what you do. It's not your role. And so my first question from the audience is going to be turning this into something really practical around what you can do. So if you were speaking to a room full of Year 12 students and future leaders, and noting that many of them are already currently doing leadership in the work and the way that they live day to day, if you're speaking to a room full of Year 12 students, what's one thing that you've learned from your leadership experiences that you wish you knew when you were in Year 12? Who wants to kick off?
I'm happy to kick off.
Thanks, Hanna.
Kristy. It's a really good question. I think for me, it comes down to like ultimately follow your heart. I still remember I had this big photo painting on my wall, even when after I had graduated from uni and when I started out working in more traditional banking, and that I at some point felt it didn't feel right. And it comes down to what makes you personally happy, given that we are spending so much time at work. So for me, it comes really down to what probably intrinsically, over time, you might get to know yourself better, reflect, get input from others, follow your heart in terms of where you think you find happiness. And hopefully, I think then, success and, having a great impact comes alongside those as well.
Thanks, Hanna. Follow your heart's really a very practical, lovely thing to do. Shirley?
I think, my whole career I've straddled both the corporate space and the not-for-profit space. And the not-for-profit space is in desperate need of great people. So if you're leaving school today and thinking about a career, I would just say, don't be scared of jumping straight into the not-for-profit space. There are great roles regardless of what it is you want to do, and great ways that you can immediately make an impact and a difference.
Thanks, Shirley. Certainly panned out okay for most of us in this group. Beck?
I would really encourage young women to go and find women that really inspire them, and then go and ask them for a coffee and then go and start doing things with those women. The best thing I ever did was write a list of what I wanted in a mentor and go and try and find a female mentor, because I was so used to being surrounded by just men in every direction at CSIRO that I really, really wanted to see an older woman who didn't, who was, I guess, behaving in a really different way. And so I wrote my wish list and thought, oh my God, how will I ever find this woman? And then I started to show that wish list to my female friends. And one of those wonderful, wonderful women said, oh my God, I know exactly who that is. That's Dawn O'Neill. She's the CEO of Lifeline. I'll introduce you to her. Dawn actually ended up being a mentor for a couple of years, but then ended up being the first founding board chair of STREAT, and is now one of my dearest friends. So finding those women who you can see that are already on the path ahead of you. And I, again and again, I've found women to be so generous that when you make that approach, and you even if it's just for a coffee, I've seen nothing but generosity of spirit for most women, trying to help the next generation of young women coming through.
That's beautiful. And I like the connection to your point, Beck, about not being afraid to reach out, and Shirley's point on don't be scared, because amazing things can happen, and that generosity of spirit is absolutely there. Leah, what's your advice?
Yeah, look, just following on that, all of those wonderful points there, it's believe in yourself, believe in your own power.
Yeah, beautiful. Self-belief is a wonderful thing. I'm just going to go to some of the other questions. And Leah, while your mic is on, I might turn to you first for this first question. And let me just pull this up. So Deb has been watching Four Corners last night, and we don't need to have seen it, don't worry. But what she's reflecting on is seeing the complete lack of philanthropy and in that sense of human kindness. And she said that they showed the Dumanji community from their rural hospital locally. And her question then is, how can we ensure that kindness drives health policy and practice in First Nations communities, particularly in remote communities?
Yeah, look, certainly. And I did see the Four Corners report, and disturbing what happened for young women, Aboriginal women in Dumanji last night. And fundamentally, going back to also some of the comments we're talking about, I think we need to recognise and face that, you know, the truth of our history in Australia that, you know, has been around for, you know, since colonisation, and how, you know, that has embedded systemic racism in our system. So, you know, kindness needs to acknowledge also the truth. So I know we talked about, you know, the deficit piece earlier, but, you know, that's only half of the truth. We can't brush over, you know, the hard truth that they need to be acknowledged. But also, you know, ensuring that, you know, we also recognise the power that is in communities, that, you know, that Doomadgee and the connectedness in communities there could be a powerful force if they've given the right resources and support from a health system. So I think, you know, from a kindness perspective is how can you support the Doomadgee community to be more self-determining, and that's how I would approach it.
Thanks, Leah. The follow-up question from Helen in the audience was around how do we balance, let me ask it the way Helen does. So she's wondering about the expectations put on young Aboriginal women and men who are doing well, and that are then asked to take on a whole lot of roles and responsibilities, and what that does for their health and well-being. And Leah, I want to start with you, but maybe go to Beck or Shirley or someone else in the audience to see how this also impacts on other marginalised groups, or groups that are normally in the minority in that weight of role and responsibility. Leah, over to you in the first instance.
Yeah, look, certainly there, you know, there is that expectations, but there is also young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who know that is part of, you know, their values and culture. So, you know, it is, you know, that they want to give back to community, that they want to be engaged. So we see a lot of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are coming through who spent time in corporate Australia, who are now actually saying, well, you know, we want to give back to our communities and get engaged in supporting what's happening in communities. So I mean, it is a lot of work and can be quite destructive to our well-being, but it's also managing that by having that connectedness with community does help in, you know, addressing that as well, and being out on country does help for the young people to balance that. I think it's, you know, it's the more expectation than in terms of, you know, being the right type of employee in certain corporate, you know, in that sort of modelling of what it should be to be the right employee. That expectation, you know, is equally destructive to young Aboriginal professionals as well.
Thanks, Leah. Beck, I'm wondering if you wanted to pick up this in terms of what you've seen from the students that you've supported. And then also there's another question here around from Esther, around how do you think young women's capacity to bond and bridge using your capital pieces in deeper ways can be enhanced? And she worries about women becoming invisible, particularly at the, you know, after COVID and lockdowns, etc. So anything that you've seen around, you know, how we support young people who might be in the minority to hold roles and responsibilities. And then the second piece, how can we support women's capacity to bond and bridge in deeper ways that might otherwise be not seen?
I guess one of the things that we know from literature on systems and how systems work, and also how we transform systems is that there's kind of different levels, or, you know, in a system that we can work, and there's a whole bunch of structures in those systems. But the kind of grassroots where I work, you know, it's all of those smaller organisations and communities is where I work. And what we know from the way we shift systems kind of at the grassroots is by what often gets talked about is getting the actors to work together. So collaboration and building collaborative structures becomes really important. And so I think one of the things that we've known for a long time, but we have to keep on reminding ourselves, is that networks matter. When we're talking, you know, if bridging social capital and bonding social capital sounds a bit esoteric, but all it is doing stuff with other people. It's going, you know, it's reaching sideways to people who you know, want to do the same sorts of things. So I really don't think we can underestimate finding what you love, what you're passionate about personally. So what is it that really kind of lights you up? And then finding others who are passionate about that same thing, but doing that as groups of people together, and particularly as networks, because we know that networks start to shift things. And so what we find is there's certain types of networks have more bridging capital in them. So we find, for example, groups like choirs. Choirs are networks that are really, really rich in bridging social capital. That there's an enormous amount of diversity in groups like choirs. Whereas you might get other kind of more narrowly defined, social capital. So finding those activities that you can do, whether or not they're just, social activities, or whether or not they're things that you're rolling your sleeves up and you're starting to do stuff in a community with others, the more diversity that you're bringing, or that you're creating in that activity that you're doing, the more likely that you are to start to innovate and start to shift a system. So, look for people that don't look like you to do stuff with, in short.
Nice summary. Look for people that don't look like you. I mean, we have some amazing leaders around, and many of them are, doing very formal roles and sometimes really super informal roles. But back to the leaders of our not-for-profits and people in that space, Shirley, I want to ask you a question from Galena around what's the best way that philanthropy can support not-for-profit leaders to find that space you were talking about, Shirley, around space to think and strategize and innovate and to lead. What role could philanthropy play in supporting this?
I think there's two things from my perspective. I think training and support and leadership training in particular. So I think a lot of not-for-profits rely on gifts, if you like, from the corporate world or from the big philanthropists to do leadership training, because there's not enough money or resources ever to do that. So I think, if you're a corporate and you're running a leadership program and you have a spare space, reach out to an organization, a social venture, an social enterprise, a not-for-profit organization, and offer those spare spaces to the leaders in that group. I think that can go a really long way. I think the second thing is a piece of work that you did, Kristy, actually in your earlier life, around CEO sabbaticals. I think if we can create space for CEOs and leaders in not-for-profits to step out of their day role, mandated space. So it's not that they're doing it on annual leave because they desperately need annual leave, but we're giving them time away from their job to think about other things. That's when the epiphanies come. That's when the best thinking comes. So I think that's the role philanthropy can play. It's not just about paying for operational costs or donating money. I think donating money is on my list. It's often the last thing that big philanthropy should be doing. It's about thinking about how to create those changes, far-reaching changes in the organisations.
Thanks, Shirley. Great points. And Catherine Brown's added in the chat a piece around the importance of funding the things that are sort of less exciting, like collaborations and networks, which also feeds into all of the points many of you are making around the ecosystem, and is a great advertisement for my role as Chief Alliances Officer. And I didn't cede that one, I promise. Hanna, over to you. I want to combine two questions. A question from Raji, and this comes back to sort of Shirley's points in a way around like old philanthropy versus new and etc. With a question from Ben. So Raji asks, in shifting the dial in the way that you've all described, old philanthropy and traditional philanthropy work, how do we bring that group on the journey of evolution so we're not just reframing the language and the culture and the assets by ourselves? So how do we bring them along? And then Ben asks, could you use an example from like Sefa and how you've seen that evolve to help us understand this?
Yeah, no, really two good questions. I'll try to tackle the first one. In terms of, obviously there's a evolution, especially, new generation taking over at the helm of foundations in terms of that almost again conflict or like different probably way of looking at things through the granting philanthropic arm and then the pure investment corpus of a foundation. And so looking more at like, how can we use capital as a tool, and what do we need the capital to look like to ultimately achieve the change, the social change that we want to see by investing into social businesses. And sometimes that way, the capital that we might be using now as opposed to a couple of decades ago may look different. There's new form in terms of financial structures and more creativity and innovation, even in the very traditional world of finance. And so bringing them closer together to ultimately combine that purpose and being sustainable, financially over time as well. And I think, then picking up on that point from Ben, from an example, obviously Sefa is also being a lot of the bridging and bonding role between the demand for capital and capability from purpose-driven organization, and then on the more of the supply side from investors. And I think it's really around actually facilitating that dialogue and showcasing that sometimes, structures that are unusual might not necessarily be higher risk. There might be different risk, but it's appropriate for the time that we are living in, because we need to sometimes also maybe even accept failure, because if we can't learn and we can't make mistakes, then we can't progress and ultimately build back better, as we are currently saying, all those terms like pivoting after the bushfires and after COVID, to ultimately try new ways of using capital as a tool.
Thanks, Hanna. I'm conscious that a bunch of people probably have 9:30 commitments, and we said we'd close. I want us to do something quite practical as we close. And I think, going back to philanthropy is about the love of humankind and that sense of generosity of spirit. It's what we do. It's not always what our titles or roles actually say. What is one action that I would like to encourage the audience to think this through too? What's one action that you can do today, tomorrow, next week that might be generosity of kindness, generosity of spirit, something to use your time, your talent, your treasure, or to reach out to somebody else? So one action that you, each of you on this call will do in the short to medium term for a more equitable tomorrow. Hanna, you're off mute. You can go first.
Sure. I think it'll be actually a very practical one, welcoming 2 additional team members to Sefa who are, transitioning into the exciting world of combining capital capability, working with social entrepreneurs, and actually making them welcome and making them part of the team and, driving together forward. So giving time, I think, is a really important element in getting people, excited, support them, and then walk that pathway together.
Beautiful. Thanks, Hanna. Giving time, I like it. Leah?
I guess the one action is really about that reaching out for networks. I think it's really critical. Beck sums it up so well in the conversation, that these networks are important. So how to build those networks.
Thanks, Leah. Shirley?
I think mine is it's International Women's Day, and I think, we as women leaders all stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. And I think it's really important to remember that future generations have the right to stand on our shoulders as well. So for me, it's more a question, and it's a question that I'd pose to everybody. What are you doing what am I doing to empower the next generation of women? And it's, is it through conversations? Is it through time, as Hanna said? But asking ourselves that question can often be quite confronting, because you realize that you're perhaps not doing as much as you'd like to be doing.
Beautiful. I love that. Thanks, Shirley. And Beck?
I am the queen of side projects. I will forever have a crazy harebrained side project that I've got happening in my studio. And I always use those side projects as a way of weaving together really different collaborators that I normally wouldn't work with. So often I'm collaborating with artists and poets and creative people. So really different stuff to what I do in my day job. So I'm gonna do some more side project stuff, but the weaving together of those people in that, I want to keep the weave really loose. Think about it as a really porous weave of so I can invite as many others into that structure that we all weave together.
And imagine the beautiful baskets and creations that you will make with that weaving. What a fabulous action. Look, I think those are wonderful actions. Please do have a think about one thing that you might do. And I do love, Shirley, your empowerment piece around, how do we empower the next generation? One of the things that I want to start doing is looking out for other ways that we can tell the stories of women and different ways that we can talk about philanthropy. It is International Women's Day. Please celebrate all the wonderful women in your life. Thank you. And please join me in thanking the most wonderful panel who have given their time incredibly generously. Leah Armstrong, Shirley Chowdhary, Hanna, Ebeling and Bex Scott. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to the team behind this at PRF, particular to Rebecca at our end, who's done a lot of work organising this event. And thank you to you all for joining us. Go forth and have a fabulous International Women's Day. Thank you.